The door rattled once, then went still. From inside the bathroom I heard the faint swell of wedding music, and outside, somewhere beyond the frosted glass engines, idled. Low, smooth, expensive, one after another. By the time the 10th limousine pulled up to the curb, the laughter in the reception hall had thinned into a brittle hush. No one knew it yet, but the story my parents had been telling about me was about to collapse. I stood alone, palms pressed to the cool porcelain sink, breathing slowly so I wouldn't cry. The message still glowed on my phone screen, cruel and unmistakable. That's where you belong. Out here is only for real family. My mother had typed it, my father had liked it. And then silence. 30 minutes earlier, they'd locked me in this bathroom at my sister's wedding. I smiled then, not because it was funny, because it was final. I made one call. It hadn't started with anger. That's what people never understand. It started the way these things always do, with me trying to help. The venue was a renovated country club on the edge of town, the kind with white clapboard siding and a flagpole out front. My sister Elaine had chosen it because it looked classic. I arrived early as requested, wearing a navy dress I already owned, so I wouldn't outshine the bride or waste money. My parents greeted me with tight smiles, the kind that never reached their eyes. "Can you run a few errands?" my mother asked, already turning away. "Flowers need checking. The caterer has questions." I nodded. I always did. For 46 years, nodding had been my role. Elaine swept past me in lace and satin glowing. She didn't look my way. I told myself she was nervous. I told myself a lot of things. By noon, guests began to arrive. Old friends, distant relatives, neighbors from the street where my parents still lived. I caught snippets of conversation, beautiful day, perfect match, proud parents, and felt myself fading into the background just as I always had. Then my father touched my elbow. "Bathroom's clogged," he said quietly. "We need you to check it before the ceremony." It should have sounded strange. Instead, it sounded familiar. "Fix this. Handle that. Don't make a fuss." Inside the bathroom, the light buzzed faintly. I ran the faucet, checked the toilet. Everything worked. When I turned back, the door was closing. I heard the click of the lock. At first, I laughed. Surely this was a mistake. "Dad," I called. Very funny. No answer. I knocked. Harder. My phone buzzed. The family group chat, the Johnsons, lit up. My mother's message appeared, followed by my father's reaction. "That's where you belong. Out here is only for real family." I reread it 3 times as if it might change. It didn't. Outside, the music swelled. Inside, something in me went quiet. I sat on the closed toilet lid and let the memories come uninvited and relentless. Christmas mornings where Elaine's pile of gifts dwarfed mine. My college acceptance letter that earned a nod while my sister's engagement got a party. The way my parents spoke of her accomplishments and my responsibilities. I had moved out years ago, built a life they never asked about, worked 2 jobs, then 3, learned how to be steady when no one clapped. I paid my bills. I paid off my house. I paid quietly into a fund that helped people who showed up on time and kept their word. I wiped my eyes, straightened my shoulders, and made the call. "Hi, Mark," I said when he answered. "I need a favor." He didn't ask questions. He never did. We'd worked together for over a decade, contracts, logistics, planning. He knew my voice. He knew when I meant it. "Give me 30 minutes, he said. I hung up and waited. Time moved differently in that bathroom. Every sound was amplified, the clink of silverware being set, the murmur of guests finding their seats. I imagined my parents smiling for photos, my sister walking down the aisle. I imagined the story they were telling, that I was late, that I couldn't be bothered, that I didn't belong. When the engines arrived, I felt them before I heard them. A low vibration through the tile. Then whispers. A pause in the music. The lock turned. The door opened to my mother's face, pale and pinched. "What did you do?" she hissed. I stepped past her into the hallway, my shoes silent on the carpet. Heads turned. Conversations stopped. Through the glass doors at the front of the venue, 10 black limousines lined the drive, polished and unmistakable. Men and women in tailored suits stood beside them, checking watches, scanning the room. Mark caught my eye and nodded once. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I walked to the center of the room and held up my phone. "You told me I wasn't real family," I said, calm as a held breath. So I brought people who know me. Silence answered. I looked at my parents, then really looked. At the fear, the confusion, the dawning understanding that control had slipped through their fingers. This wedding will go on, I said. I won't ruin it, but I won't hide anymore. I turned and walked out, the sound of my footsteps steady and sure, leaving behind a room that had finally learned my name. The door closed behind me with a soft final sound, and the noise of the reception swelled again, as if nothing had happened. Laughter returned in cautious bursts. Music resumed a little too loud, a little too fast. I didn't look back. I walked past the limousines, past Mark and the others who had shown up without asking for explanations, and I kept going until I reached the far end of the parking lot where my car sat alone. Only then did my hands begin to shake. I sat behind the steering wheel without starting the engine, my phone heavy in my palm. The family group chat was still open. My mother's message, "That's where you belong," sat at the top like a bruise. Under it, new notifications stacked up quickly, missed calls, texts, names I recognized and names I barely remembered. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I closed my eyes and let the weight of it all settle. Not the humiliation I'd lived with that too long to feel it sharply anymore, but the clarity. The kind that comes when something ugly finally says its name out loud. I thought back to when that bathroom door first locked. How my heart had raced, how instinct had told me to pound and shout and demand to be let out. But I hadn't. Somewhere deep inside, an older, quieter part of me had taken over. The part that had learned over decades that begging never changed anything in my family, only consequences did. That message hadn't just been cruel, it had been honest. I started the car and drove. I didn't go home right away. I drove aimlessly through streets I'd known since childhood, past the elementary school where my sister's achievements still hung framed in the hallway, past the diner where my parents were greeted by name. I wondered how many people there truly knew me, and how many only knew the version of me my parents had curated. When I finally pulled into my driveway, dusk had settled. I went inside, poured myself a glass of water, and sat at the kitchen table. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that used to scare me, and now felt like safety. That night I slept deeply for the first time in weeks. The next morning the reckoning began. My phone rang at 7:30. I let it ring. At 8 a text came from my father. "We need to talk." I stared at the words, feeling the old pull, the reflex to fix, to smooth, to make things easier for everyone else. I typed back slowly, "I'm listening." The call came seconds later. "How could you embarrass us like that?" my mother demanded before I could even say hello. "Do you have any idea what people are saying?" I pictured her standing in the kitchen of my childhood home, arms crossed, jaw set. I'd seen that posture all my life. "I read your message," I replied evenly. "The one you sent while I was locked in a bathroom." A pause, not denial, not apology, just silence. "That was misunderstood," my father said at last. "Things got out of hand." "No," I said. "They finally stayed in hand." Another pause, heavier this time. "You didn't have to bring strangers," my mother said. "This was family business." "They aren't strangers to me," I answered. "That's the point." The call ended without resolution. No apology, no accountability. But something had shifted. I could hear it in their voices, a crack where certainty used to be. Over the next few days, messages trickled in from extended family. Some careful, some clumsy. A cousin apologized for not noticing. An aunt told me she'd always wondered why I was treated differently. A few said nothing at all. Elaine was silent. That hurt more than I expected. I replayed our childhood in my mind, looking for moments I might have missed, times she could have stood up for me and didn't, or maybe never knew she could. I remembered her borrowing my clothes without asking, taking credit for shared projects, laughing when our parents praised her for being the strong one. Strong, that word had always been hers. Mine had been reliable. On the 4th day she finally called. I didn't know she said, her voice tight, about the bathroom, about the message. I believed her. That didn't erase anything, but it mattered. "I know," I replied. She exhaled shakily. "Mom and Dad said you volunteered to help and then disappeared. They said you didn't want to be in the pictures." I laughed, once short and humorless. "Does that sound like me?" "No," she admitted, "it doesn't." We talked for an hour, Not fighting, not fixing, just laying pieces on the table and seeing how they fit. She cried. I didn't. I'd done my crying in quieter rooms. I don't know how to undo what they did, she said. You don't have to undo it, I told her. You just have to stop pretending it didn't happen. After we hung up, I sat back and thought about the wedding, about the look on my parents' faces when the truth entered the room. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't destroyed anything they loved. I had simply refused to be hidden. That I realized was the real revenge. Not the limousines, not the silence, but the moment I stopped agreeing with their version of me. I opened the family group chat one last time and typed a message of my own. I won't be where I'm told I belong anymore. I'll be where I'm treated with respect. Then I muted the conversation and set the phone down. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for permission. The quiet that followed felt unfamiliar, like stepping into a room you've never been allowed to enter. I expected guilt to rush in and fill the space, or fear, or some sharp pang of regret. Instead, what came was a calm I didn't trust at first, the kind that makes you look over your shoulder waiting for the old chaos to catch up. It didn't. What did arrive 2 days later was an email from Mark. Just checking in, everything okay? I smiled at the screen. Mark had been part of my life for years, but never the personal parts. We met when I was still juggling contract work and night classes, trying to build something solid out of borrowed time and stubbornness. He ran a regional logistics firm, then nothing glamorous, just efficient and growing. We crossed paths again and again, always professionally, always reliably. I typed back, I'm okay, thank you for showing up. His reply came quickly. Anytime. You didn't sound like someone asking for a favor. You sounded like someone drawing a line. He wasn't wrong. That line had been years in the making. After I muted the family chat, I began to notice how much of my energy had gone into managing their reactions. Every choice I'd made, where to live, what job to take, when to visit, had been filtered through a question I'd never consciously asked, will this make things worse? Worse for them, not me. Without that constant calculation, my days felt strangely open. I went to work, attended meetings, returned calls. People treated me the way they always had, with respect, with expectation, with trust. No one questioned whether I belonged in the room. I thought about the call I'd made from the bathroom, about how easily Mark had agreed to help. He hadn't asked what I planned to do. He hadn't demanded justification. He'd simply recognized something in my voice and responded. It occurred to me that the people who mattered had always known who I was. I just hadn't let myself believe them. On Thursday afternoon, my assistant knocked lightly on my office door. Your parents are online too, she said carefully. They didn't say why. I felt the old tightening in my chest, the instinct to brace myself. Then I exhaled and picked up the phone. We need to meet, my father said. His voice was flatter than usual, stripped of authority. In person. I agreed on my terms. Saturday morning, a coffee shop halfway between our houses, neutral ground. They arrived early. I arrived on time. My mother looked tired. Not fragile, she'd never been fragile, but unsettled, like someone whose map had stopped matching the road. My father sat stiffly, hands folded around his cup. You humiliated us, he began. I held up a hand. Before we go any further, I want to say something. I'm not here to argue about how it looked. I'm here to talk about what happened. My mother's mouth tightened. We didn't think. That's true, I said gently. You didn't. I took out my phone and placed it face up on the table, the message visible. Neither of them touched it. I want to understand, I continued, why you felt comfortable writing that, why locking me in a bathroom seemed reasonable. They exchanged a glance. Years of shared language passed between them, and for the first time I wasn't fluent in it. We were under stress, my mother said at last. Elaine's wedding, people watching. You've always complicated things. The word landed exactly where it always had. I've always existed, I corrected. And you've always decided that was inconvenient. My father cleared his throat. Your sister needed the day to be perfect. And I needed to be treated like a daughter, I replied. Silence stretched between us. Not the brittle kind from the reception hall, but something heavier. Something that demanded honesty. You were strong, my mother said quietly. You never complained. I nodded. You mistook my survival for consent. That was when she cried. Not dramatically, just a slow, leaking grief that surprised even her. My father stared into his cup as if answers might surface there. "We didn't know how much damage we'd done," he said. "You didn't ask," I replied, "and I won't pretend anymore." We talked for nearly 2 hours. No shouting, no absolution. Just truths laid bare and imperfect. They apologized not cleanly, not completely, but sincerely enough to matter. I didn't forgive them that day. I told them I might someday. Forgiveness, I'd learned, wasn't a performance. When we stood to leave, my mother hesitated. "Are we still your family?" I looked at her and answered honestly, "You can be, but not the way it was." That afternoon I called Elaine. "I met with them," I told her. She sighed. I figured. "I'm not asking you to choose sides," I said. "I just need you to see me clearly." "I am," she replied. I always did. I just didn't want to look too closely." We agreed to meet the following week, just the two of us. As I drove home, I passed the country club where the wedding had taken place. The parking lot was empty now, the drama reduced to memory. I realized something then that settled deep in my bones. The call I'd made from that bathroom hadn't changed my parents. It had changed me. And that finally was enough. Elaine chose a quiet cafe near the river, the kind with mismatched chairs and handwritten menus. It was neutral territory again, which felt right. When I walked in, she was already there stirring her coffee, though it had long gone cold. She looked older than she had at the wedding, not aged exactly, but stripped of something glossy. Reality had a way of doing that. "Hi," she said, standing too quickly. We hugged briefly and awkwardly, like people relearning how. For a moment we just sat there, the hum of other conversations filling the space. Outside, the river moved steadily indifferent to family drama. "I keep replaying it," she said finally. "The bathroom, the message. I didn't know. I swear I didn't." "I believe you," I said, and I did. She nodded, relief flickering across her face. "I should have noticed things growing up. I didn't. It was easier not to." I sipped my tea and let her words land. "Easier for you," I said, not unkindly. "Harder for me." She swallowed. "I know." We talked then, not as rivals or roles, but as two women shaped by the same house in different ways. She spoke about the pressure to be perfect, to stay in our parents' good graces. I spoke about the freedom and loneliness of living outside their spotlight. Neither of us had escaped unscathed. "I didn't realize how much you carried," she said softly. "I didn't realize how much you were afraid," I replied. When we parted, there was no grand resolution, just a tentative bridge newly built. That night my phone buzzed again. A message from Mark, this one more formal. "Some of the partners would like to meet you. They were impressed by how you handled the situation." I smiled at the understatement. Handled the situation felt like a polite way to describe a lifetime boiling over. The meeting was set for the following Monday. A conference room overlooking downtown, glass walls and clean lines. As I walked in, I was greeted not as a curiosity, but as a peer. They spoke to me about projects, about leadership, about values. No one mentioned the wedding directly, but I knew it hovered there unspoken. At one point, one of them leaned back and said, "You know, not many people would have kept their composure." I shrugged. "Composure comes from practice." He nodded, understanding more than I'd said. After the meeting, Mark walked me to the elevator. "You didn't do it to prove anything," he said. "That's what got their attention." "I didn't do it for them at all," I replied. He smiled. "Exactly." As the doors closed, I felt a sense of alignment I hadn't known before. The outside world had always made sense to me. It was my family that felt foreign. A week later, my parents invited me to dinner. I didn't answer right away. Boundaries, I was learning, weren't about punishment. They were about pacing. I countered with lunch, public limited. At the restaurant, my mother spoke carefully, as if each word had to be approved by an invisible committee. My father listened more than he talked. They asked about my work, about my life. Questions they'd never bothered to ask before. "I didn't know you owned your place outright," my father said, surprised. "You never asked," I replied. There it was again, not accusation, just fact. Halfway through the meal, my mother reached across the table. Her hand hovered uncertain, then rested on mine. "We failed you," she said. The words trembled, but they were there. "We thought we were doing what was best for the family." "You were doing what was easiest," I answered. "There's a difference." She nodded slowly. "We see that now." "Did they?" I didn't know. Change, I'd learned, wasn't a single moment. It was a series of choices made when no one was watching. That afternoon, I drove to a small storage unit I'd kept for years. Inside were boxes of old papers, photos, keepsakes I'd never unpacked because they didn't fit neatly into the life I was building. I opened one and found a picture of me at 17, standing at the edge of a family photo half cropped out. I studied the girl in the picture, her stiff smile, her determined eyes. I wished I could tell her what I knew now. You don't disappear because they don't see you. You become visible when you stop shrinking. The following Sunday, Elaine called again. I talked to Mom and Dad, she said. Really talked. I don't think they understood what favoritism does. Not until now. That's on them, I said gently. I know, but I want to do better. I believed her, or at least I believed in the possibility. The day ended quietly. No limousines, no dramatic entrances, just a woman folding laundry, cooking dinner, living in a body that finally felt like her own. The wedding had been a catalyst, not a climax. The real shift was happening now in these ordinary moments where I chose myself without apology. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what came next. The story that lingered in people's minds wasn't the limousines themselves. It was what happened after what I did with the moment I'd been handed. Power, I'd learned, reveals itself not when it arrives, but in how quietly it leaves. By the time a week had passed, the version of events circulating through town had splintered into a dozen tellings. Some said I'd planned the whole thing months in advance. Others insisted I was secretly wealthy and had finally decided to flaunt it. A few whispered that my parents must have done something unforgivable because no one reacted like that without a reason. None of them were completely right. None of them were completely wrong. What mattered was that the truth no longer belonged solely to my parents. Elaine called me late one evening, her voice unsteady. "They're not sleeping," she said. "They keep replaying it. Mom keeps asking how people could look at her like that." I closed my eyes, picturing my mother at the kitchen table, hands folded too tightly around a mug she wasn't drinking from. "That's what accountability feels like," I said softly. "It's uncomfortable." "She wants to talk to you again." "I know," I replied, "and I will, when we're ready to talk about what actually happened." 2 days later, my father showed up at my house unannounced. I saw his car through the front window and felt a familiar tightening followed by something new choice. I didn't have to open the door, I did anyway. He stood there awkwardly, hands in his coat pockets, eyes scanning the porch like he was waiting to be invited inside a life he didn't recognize anymore. "Can we sit?" he asked. We did, at my kitchen table, on my terms. "I didn't think people would believe you," he admitted, staring down at the wood grain. I thought they'd believe us." "That's because you've always controlled the narrative," I said. "You weren't prepared for witnesses." He flinched just slightly. "You embarrassed us," he said again, but the words had lost their edge. They sounded tired now. But worse than that, "You showed us." I nodded. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult anyone. I just told the truth. He looked up, then really looked at me. "You've always been good at that." The admission landed heavier than an apology. Praise had been rationed in our house, and never in ways that mattered. "Why her?" I asked. The question had lived in me for decades. Why was Elaine always enough and I never was? He sighed, shoulders slumping. "Because she needed us. And you didn't, or so we told ourselves." I thought of that bathroom, the lock clicking into place, the message glowing on my phone. "Needing less doesn't mean deserving less," I said. He nodded slowly. "I know that now." After he left, I sat alone and let myself feel it all, the grief for what had been lost, the anger for what had been done, and the strange relief of no longer carrying it alone. The truth, once spoken, had a way of insisting on daylight. The following Sunday, Elaine invited me over. Just me, no parents. Her house was still half unpacked from the honeymoon suitcases, lingering like reminders of a life she was still learning how to step into. "I don't want to repeat what they did," she said as we sat on the couch. "I don't want to be that kind of person." "Then don't," I said. "Notice who gets less, and ask why." She nodded, eyes shining. I didn't know how much silence could hurt. "It hurts more than shouting," I replied, "because it teaches you you're not worth responding to." She reached for my hand. This time it didn't feel tentative, it felt earned. Outside, our family life continued to open in small, steady ways. Work expanded. Conversations deepened. People treated me with the same respect they always had, but now I let it register. I stopped deflecting compliments. I stopped minimizing my own contributions. One afternoon, my assistant forwarded me an email from a woman I didn't know. She'd been at the wedding. She wrote about her own family, about being the quiet one, the reliable one, the invisible one. "Watching you stand there without anger changed something for me," she wrote. "I didn't know you could do that." I sat back, stunned. I hadn't intended to teach anyone anything. I just refused to disappear. That was when I understood something essential. Quiet revenge isn't about humiliation. It's about correction. It reorders the story so the truth has space to exist. When my parents invited me to a small family dinner a month later, I accepted. Not as a return to normal, but as a test of it. No locked doors. No side comments. No messages sent where they couldn't be challenged. Just 4 people at a table speaking carefully, listening more than they talked. It wasn't perfect, it was honest. And honesty, I'd learned, was the most disruptive force of all. Dinner ended without ceremony. No hugs, no declarations, just plates cleared, chairs pushed back, and a quiet understanding that something fragile but real had taken root. In the weeks that followed, the family didn't magically heal. That was never how it worked. Healing, I was learning, looked less like a breakthrough and more like maintenance. It showed up in pauses before speaking, in questions that used to be assumptions, in apologies that didn't demand forgiveness on a timetable. My parents began calling not to instruct, not to correct, but to ask. About my work, about my house, about the parts of my life they'd once treated like background noise. Sometimes the calls were awkward. Sometimes they drifted into old patterns and had to be gently redirected. I did the redirecting. That alone felt revolutionary. Elaine and I met for coffee every other week, not out of obligation but curiosity. We were learning each other as adults without the distortion of roles assigned in childhood. She spoke openly about the pressure she'd lived under, the unspoken rule that her value depended on staying perfect. I listened and for the first time didn't feel erased by her story. "I thought being chosen meant being loved," she admitted once. "I didn't realize it also meant being controlled." I nodded. "And I thought being overlooked meant being free. I didn't realize it also meant being alone." We sat with that truth, letting it exist without trying to rank our pain. Comparison had done enough damage already. Outside, the family consequences continued to ripple. Some relatives pulled away uncomfortable with the shift in power. Others leaned in newly honest about dynamics they'd never known how to name. I didn't chase anyone. That too was new. At work, something subtle changed. I found myself speaking more directly, less inclined to soften my words for the sake of harmony. The result wasn't conflict, it was clarity. Meetings ended sooner. Decisions landed cleaner. Respect. I discovered grew fastest, where self-respect had been planted first. One afternoon, Mark stopped by my office. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed loosely. "You know," he said, "I've watched a lot of people over the years. Most of them confuse power with noise." I smiled, and quiet with weakness. "Exactly," he replied. "You proved something important that day." "I proved it to myself," I said. "That's the part that mattered." At home, I finally unpacked the last of the storage boxes. Old report cards, photographs, letters I'd written and never sent. I didn't throw them away, I sorted them. Some memories deserved to stay, others needed to be released. I paused over a card my mother had written decades earlier. "We're proud of you," it said, unsigned, tucked into a stack of paperwork like an afterthought. I understood now what I hadn't then. Pride withheld becomes a currency. And I had spent too long trying to earn what should have been freely given. That realization didn't make me bitter, it made me careful. The real aftermath wasn't dramatic, it was quiet. It lived in boundaries held without apology, in relationships renegotiated instead of resumed, in the steady refusal to step back into a role that required me to shrink. One evening, my father said something that stayed with me. We were on the phone talking about nothing in particular when he paused and said, "I didn't know how much strength it took for you to stay kind." I considered that. "Kindness isn't the same as compliance," I replied. I confused the two for a long time. "So did we," he admitted. That was enough for that day. I had gone into the wedding thinking I was attending an ending, Elaine's beginning, my parents' moment of pride. Instead, I had walked into a turning point, not because of the limousines or the witnesses or the silence that followed, but because I finally chose myself without asking permission. The fallout wasn't destruction, it was redefinition. And in that space, something better had room to grow. Time did what it always does when you stop fighting it. It softened the sharpest edges and clarified what remained. Months passed, seasons shifted. The story of the wedding settled into its proper place, not a spectacle, not a scandal, but a lesson. My parents didn't become different people overnight. They became more aware ones. Awareness, I'd learned, was the true beginning of change. They asked before assuming. They listened without interrupting. When they slipped, and they corrected themselves without being prompted. That mattered more than grand apologies ever could. Elaine and I found a rhythm. Not the forced closeness people expect from siblings, but something steadier. Mutual respect, chosen honesty. We talked about ordinary things: work, stress, aging bodies, the quiet fears that creep in after 40. Sometimes we talked about the past. Sometimes we didn't need to. One afternoon we walked along the river near that cafe where we'd first met after the wedding. The water moved the same way it always had, unconcerned with human reckoning. I used to think family meant loyalty at any cost, Elaine said. Now I think it means telling the truth before the cost gets too high. I smiled. That's an education some people never get. At work, I took on a mentorship role I'd previously avoided. Younger colleagues came to me not just for guidance, but for reassurance that success didn't require becoming louder or harder. I told them what I wished someone had told me years ago. You don't have to perform for your worth. You just have to honor it. At home, my life felt spacious, not empty, intentional. I hosted dinners with friends who knew my whole story and didn't flinch at it. I took long walks without music, letting my thoughts settle instead of racing ahead. I learned that peace wasn't passive. It was built deliberately, choice by choice. The memory of the bathroom still surfaced now and then. The click of the lock, the glow of the message. But it no longer hurt the way it once had. It had transformed from a wound into a boundary marker. A reminder of what I would never accept again. One evening, my mother asked if I'd come over to help her sort through old photo albums. I hesitated, then agreed. We sat at the dining room table, flipping through decades of moments frozen in time. Birthdays, holidays, smiles that hid more than they revealed. She paused over one photo of me as a teenager, standing apart from the rest. "I don't remember taking this," she said quietly. "I do," I replied. "I remember feeling invisible." She nodded, eyes shining. "I see it now." That was all she said. That was enough. What I learned from all of this, what I want to leave you with, is simple but not easy. Families don't just wound through cruelty. They wound through neglect, through silence, through the quiet decision to prioritize comfort over fairness. Favoritism doesn't always look like love for one child. Sometimes it looks like the absence of protection for another. And revenge, real revenge, doesn't come from destruction. It comes from dignity. From refusing to participate in a lie about who you are, from choosing visibility over approval. I didn't win by humiliating my parents or ruining my sister's wedding. I won by walking out of a lifetime of small humiliations and deciding they didn't get to define me anymore. If you've ever been the reliable one, the quiet one, the one who was told directly or indirectly that you belonged somewhere smaller than your spirit, know this. You don't need an audience to reclaim your worth. You don't need limousines or witnesses or dramatic exits. You only need the courage to stop agreeing with a story that was never true. And sometimes when you do, the world adjusts in ways you never expected. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect on your own boundaries, where you've held them, and where you might need to strengthen them. If you know someone who's lived in the quiet shadows of favoritism or dismissal, consider sharing this with them. And if you'd like to hear more stories about dignity, resilience, and quiet strength reclaimed, you're welcome to stay.